Thanks, Meg. Okay, so hi everyone. Like Meg's just said, I'm Claire and I am the project officer for Skills for Bees Cymru project across Wales, which is a Bumblebee Conservation Trust project, and the whole focus of my work for the next 3 years is to increase volunteer skills, basically in identifying and recording bumblebees in an attempt to improve our data on how species are doing across Wales, and what species we've actually got, because we've got quite a few species that are very under-recorded, or they're not there, we don't know. And we've got geographically quite a lot of areas of Wales with very, very few bumblebee records, so we just don't know what we have. This is particularly the case for basically the whole area north of the M4. So southeast Wales is relatively well recorded. Most of southwest Wales is, though there are some big gaps in northern Ceredigion, northern Carmarthenshire. And I'm just going to admit that person. And yeah, and basically mid and north Wales is heavily under-recorded. So I'm delivering this evening as part of Skills for Bees Cymru. And I hope you'll enjoy it. It is a bit long. There's a lot of information, so bear with me. Rest assured, no way do you need to remember all that I'm going to tell you tonight. Some of you may know some bumblebee ID anyway. So we're only going to look at the commonate species in this session, and hopefully it will be useful for you to start recording. It is very much a beginner's course, this, so please forgive me if you are quite knowledgeable, because I'm going to go right back to basics and assume no knowledge so that we'll start at the same point. Okay, and we will have time for a quick break in the middle as well, because there are a lot of slides. Okay, so there we go. So hopefully the first half will be just looking at bumblebee background and basics, and then after tea it'll be going into a bit more detail. And I will mention about recording bumblebees at the end to give you a taster, but we will focus more on that next week. And hopefully, like I said, by the end, you'll be familiar with our commonate species and how to submit records. So, bees. When we're delivering talks to perhaps a wider audience, we are often confronted with the same questions really occur time and time again. Most people assume that all bees make honey, as I'm sure you're aware, and don't realise how many different types there are. And in Britain, we've got around about 275 bee species. Okay, so quite a good diversity. In the world, we've got about, probably not all species have been described, but it's about 25,000 species of bees. So on a global scale, we have quite a small bee fauna, and it is an incredibly diverse group. So honeybees, we have one species in the UK, Apis mellifera, which from an ecological viewpoint is regarded as a domesticated insect. There are feral colonies, which I'm sure you know, but by and large, Apis mellifera is farmed and kept for its honey. It is a social species, as I'm sure you're aware, with a queen and her female workers living within the hive. Largely domesticated, as I've said. It has a barbed sting. So it's almost like, like a swordfish blade, it's got barbs all the way down the side of the sting. So when the females sting you, they pull away and effectively the barbs stick in your skin and it pulls out those sort of gooey bits from the abdomen of the bee, and she'll die. Honeybees are corbiculate, which means they have a modified hind leg. And you can see, if you can see the mouse there, you can see she's beginning to build up her pollen load, that little white blob. It's not a brilliant picture, but a little white blob. So her hind tibia are modified into these pollen baskets. And I'm sure you've seen honeybees with their sticky pollen lumps on their back legs. They mix it with nectar and it gets stuck on there like a lump of plasticine, basically. And that's, you know, quite a highly evolved adaptation to collecting pollen for their young. So posh name is corbicula, or a corbiculate bee, but we can call them pollen baskets as well, which is an accepted term. And the thing about honeybees is that they make honey. So the purpose of their honey is to allow them to survive a temperate winter climate, so that the bees have something to eat through the cold months, and that sets them apart from the others. Okay, so solitary bees, by far the most diverse group in the world, makes up almost all of the world's bee fauna. And these bees, we have about 245 species in the UK. It fluctuates slightly. You know, some years species are discovered, and some years some might not get recorded because they're very, very few and far between, but it's around about 245 at the moment. And their distinctive feature is that females work alone. So these bees are not social insects in the same way as honeybees and bumblebees. There are some intermediate life types, but basically, generally speaking, the females work alone to build a nest and lay their eggs and provision them. They're not separated into queens and workers. They're almost entirely wild in the UK and native, unlike honeybees, which are domesticated. But there is some commercial buying and selling of solitary bees, such as the red mason bee, because they are very good at fruit tree pollination. They have a smooth sting. In many species, it's too small to puncture our skin because there's a huge variation in body form and size. They are not corbiculate, so they don't have a modified hind tibia, but instead they carry pollen dry on special pollen carrying hairs. So solitary bees, again, quite different to bumbles and honeybees in that respect. And they're young overwinter as pupae, so that's the way they survive the winter. The adults die, and deep within the nest, wherever that may be, some are ground nesters, some nest within plant stems, etc. The pupae stay dormant until the following spring and summer. So that's their kind of life strategy, really. So that's solitary bees, amazing group, really fascinating and very lovely, lots of lovely looking species in that group. And what we're going to focus on today is bumblebees. We have 10% here in the UK, which actually in terms of bumblebees is about 10% of the world's bumblebee population on our tiny island. So we do actually have quite an important group of bumblebee species in the UK, very well adapted to cooler climates. Bumblebees are social, like honeybees, so they live in a nest, or rather colony, with a queen and her female workers. So you have that physical differentiation between the big bruiser queens and their smaller daughter workers. The ones that we have in this country, our 24 species, are wild and native, but we do have commercial bumblebee imports to pollinate greenhouse crops, and that's of the buff-tailed bumblebee. They're such brilliant pollinators, and for some crops like tomatoes, they're pretty much the only pollinators. So colonies are brought in, a lot of colonies actually. They have a smooth sting, like the solitary bees, and they are corbiculate, like the honeybees. So there's kind of, they're a bit crossover between the two in terms of their adaptations. And again, if you look at this top left-hand picture of this lovely buff-tail bumblebee, you can see her triangular hind leg. It's lovely and shiny like a mirror on the surface. And that's her pollen basket there on her hind leg. In order to survive the winter, they don't make honey, and their young don't survive in a pupal or larval state. But the queens, the mated queens, which I'll go into in a sec, actually hibernate. So that's how bumblebees have evolved to survive temperate climate. Okay, so we're going to focus on the bumbles, and we'll start with the Bumblebee Year because their annual life cycle really helps when you're starting out in recording. Well, indeed, when you're more experienced as well, because what you see at a particular time of year and the behaviours you see can give clues to what you're actually seeing. So species emerge in the spring and early summer. There is a sort of time difference with different species coming out at different times with the bumblebees. The earliest ones are like end of February, March. I'm sure you've seen the big queens coming out at that time. And the first thing they need to do is feed. So they're looking for things like willow and other early pollen sources and nectar sources to fatten up after their sleep. And then they will find a nest site. And I'm sure you will have seen in the spring, you see the great big bumblebee queens zigzagging low over the ground. And that is classic nest searching behaviour. And again, where they nest depends a little bit on species. They have species preferences. But what she'll do once she's found a nest, she will create a ball of pollen and nectar into which she lays her eggs, which you can see under the bee there. And she will create a little wax cup, which she fills with nectar to sustain herself, which I think is amazing. You know, really very complex behaviour for an insect. And she will brood her eggs, and they will hatch out into daughter workers. First of all, they hatch out into larvae. She will forage while she's waiting for that to happen. But they'll hatch out into larvae, which will then hatch out into daughter workers, and they will then take over the job of foraging for the colony. So pollen is collected to feed the larvae, and nectar is drunk to keep the adults going. And once that happens, the queen stays in her nest then from the late spring into the summer, and she lays and broods her eggs, and all of her daughters help her. So she's the reproductive individual. And that's why we see in the summer lots and lots more bumblebees, because what we're seeing is the workers buzzing around collecting food to take back to bring up their sisters, basically. And then towards the end of the life cycle, in the summer, towards the end of the summer, the queen will start to lay eggs, which turn into new queens, new daughter queens, which are fed more than their sisters, their worker sisters, so they get bigger, and males. And the daughter queens might come back to the nest during the nights, etc., and feed within the nest. But the males, once they're hatched as adults, they're considerably smaller than the queens. They go off and they look for nectar sources and the hope of finding a queen from another colony to mate with. Okay, so the males don't collect any food. They don't have pollen baskets. They don't have stings. They don't protect the nest against intruders. They simply go off and they drink nectar and wait for a queen to arrive. And not many of them are lucky, but one or two of them will be, and they mate. And once those new daughter queens have mated, they will find a hibernation site and feed up and then go to sleep and hopefully survive the winter. I think the figures are about 50% survival rate, as you can imagine. But she will hopefully wake up, wake up in the spring to start that cycle again. Okay. So this helps us because when we're out recording, if you're out recording in April, you're pretty sure you're not seeing any males because they don't come out till later on. All right. And if you see the big queens in the big bees in the spring or very late in the summer, then you might be looking at a queen. So that can be really helpful. And as I'm sure you're very aware, bees as a group are absolutely fantastic pollinators, and they have a huge, as well as their sort of wildlife value, which is not measurable really, but they, as a group, they have a huge economic value to our farming industry, and figures have been put on it in the past, and it runs into billions, both at a country level and globally. And the cost of replacing that service is absolutely huge. You know, if we had to pollinate things ourselves, which is the case, that has happened in some areas where native pollinators have been lost. And bumblebees are particularly effective pollinators because for a start, they buzz pollinate. So there aren't many bee species that can buzz pollinate, which is a form of pollination where things like tomatoes and kiwi fruits and blueberries are all buzz pollinated by bumblebees. So really, really important, as well as all the wildflowers that they pollinate as well. And again, because you're linked to the Wildlife Trust, you'll know that changes in our countryside since the end of the Second World War, the loss of hay meadows and clover leas and herbal leys and all of that sort of thing has led to a dramatic decline for lots of our wildlife. I mean, this is obviously a cereal field, and here down in Pembrokeshire where I am, I'm surrounded by silage fields. There isn't much diversity in the landscape at all, only on the coast. And those changes have led to widespread declines of, well, almost all of our UK bumblebees, actually, apart from the 8 that I'm going to show you today. And 2 went extinct in the last century, at the end of the 20th century. And we have several species now that are scarce, rare or threatened. So, yeah, the effects have been quite catastrophic for bumblebees, really. Okay, so just going into a little bit more now on some basic information about bumblebees specifically. So we've got 24 species in the UK, as I've said. There's around about 250 species of bumblebee in the world, and they're all in the same genus, Bombus. So all very, very closely related. But in the UK, we split our 24 species into 2 groups. So we have the social bumblebees, which who are truly social, as we say, with 18 of our 24 species being true social bumblebees, with a queen and her daughter workers within the colony. But we have 6 species, the cuckoo bumblebees, which are in a subgenus, if we go into the Latin, and basically they've evolved a different life history. And in those species, you don't have workers. There's no caste. There's no differentiation of caste. And the cuckoo bumblebees, basically, the females attack the nests of social bumblebees and take over the nest and use the social bumblebee workers to bring up their own young. All right, so they behave exactly like cuckoo birds. It doesn't have any negative impact because, like as is the case in nature, they exist under normal circumstances in a perfect balance between host and parasite, because they are effectively social parasites. But cuckoo bumblebees exist in much lower numbers so that they don't wipe out their hosts. And they're still really good pollinators, and they're amazing to look at because the females are huge. They're like real warrior bees. So they're quite fascinating, actually, but a bit beyond our scope today. So basic anatomy, very, very basic anatomy. But when I'm talking about the bumblebee sort of ID features, just a few terms if you don't already know them. The bee is a typical insect, and like all insects, its body is in three parts: the head with the compound eyes and antenna, the thorax, which is kind of like the powerhouse of the bee, and the wings and the legs all come off the thorax, the middle bit. They do have a waspy waist because they are actually evolved from wasps, and they're, you know, relatively closely related to them. But it's kind of covered by all that fuzz, and because they're so chunky, it's not so obvious. So head, thorax, and abdomen. And in females only, they have the sting at the tip of the abdomen, 2 pairs of wings, which in flight actually hook together like Velcro. So they're pretty amazing. And the pollen baskets are on the back legs. So there we have it on an actual bee: head, thorax in the middle, and the abdomen at the back. And underneath all that fuzzy hair, they are completely black. So all bees look like that when they are bald. And they do lose their hair through the summer. Sometimes I have to say I've never seen one that bald, but you often get bald, shiny patches of black integument showing through of their hard sort of exoskeleton. Okay, so without the hairs, you can't tell them apart by just looking at them. So when starting out, I found this useful. Somebody told me this when I was learning, and I found this really useful to just begin to get my field experience with bumblebees. So we drill down our questions. First of all, have you got a bee? Because there are lots of mimics, and if you're a complete beginner, that can be very confusing in the field. If you have a bee, is it definitely a bumblebee and not a solitary bee or a honeybee? Can you tell the sex of the bee? Because sometimes the males and females of one species have different colour patterns. So being able to sex the bee becomes very important when you get into recording. Is it a cuckoo or a social? Because the cuckoos mimic the socials. Don't let all this put you off, okay? And once you kind of got all that in your head, then can you go to species? All right, but often all of that happens kind of at once. And as you get more confident, it definitely does. So bearing those questions in mind. And again, if you've got much experience with insects, you'll probably know this, but is anyone brave enough to put in the chat which one they think is the bumblebee in these two images? I can't see the chat, Meg, so if you could help me out on that.
Yep, no problem.
Any?
So one person has said bee.
Okay. Anyone else brave enough to have a go? Okay, whoever that was. I can see it now. Yeah, brilliant. Okay, so it is B. Thanks, folks. A is a hoverfly. It's a bumblebee mimic. I think it's Volucella bombilans. One of you might be able to confirm that for me. Dying to get into my hoverflies, but just no time at the moment, unfortunately. Which is the most amazing bumblebee mimic, and it even has 2 colour forms to mimic 2 different species. But the thing to look out for with hovers and bumblebees is, for me, it's the head. It's all about the head. In hoverflies, you've got these enormous compound eyes, which almost meet in the middle, and tiny, quite insignificant antenna. In the bumblebees, the antennae are really long and chunky. And there's a big gap between the compound eyes, a really big gap. The compound eyes are very much lateral. So head definitely look at the head. There are a lot of other key differences, but to me that's the most obvious one. So there's another sort of side-on shot. So the bumblebees on the left, the hoverfly on the right, beautiful mimic. And then you can see the head differences. The bumblebee with the lateral compound eyes. These are three little ocelli, as we call. They're light detectors. They're like very simple eyes, and they both have those, but in the bee, they're in that big gap. And then these chunky grey antennae, often quite droopy in the bees, quite small and insignificant in the hoverflies. Okay, so that's that. And then, oh, I won't ask you this one because this is quite obvious, I think. But here we have the bumblebee on the left, letter A, and then C is a honeybee, and B and D are both solitary bees. So I don't think you'd mix up this little male andrena, solitary bee, little male mining bee with a bumblebee. But this is the bee is a hairy-footed flower bee, and that's a female, and she's very, very bumblebee-like. So there are probably 2 or 3 species, I think, that you could mix up. So just be aware of those when you're out recording. There is no black bumblebee with orange hairy legs like that. So you do begin to learn those differences quite quickly. But yeah, there are a few solitaries. And honeybees, this is a honeybee worker, and pretty much they all look like that. They can vary on the colour on their abdomen, and I'm not a honeybee expert at all, but they are quite uniform compared to bumbles and solitary bees. So male and female with bumblebees, this is something that you get your eye into. It actually took me 2 or 3 years, but I've had people learn with me on field courses and they get it really, really quickly. So male bumblebees of all species tend to be fluffier and scruffier than their female counterparts. So with the males, you get this kind of shaggy, longer haired appearance. Okay, of the 8 we're going to look at today, 4 of them have bright yellow faces. The females don't, but all of them have quite fluffy faces. So you're thinking they've got the old facial hair going on. Males have spindly, hairy legs compared to females. They don't have pollen baskets on their hind legs, and we'll come back to that in a sec. Now, one feature that I struggle to get my eye in, but most people don't, so I have great confidence in you with this. Males have longer antennae. They are actually longer. There's 13 little segments in the male antennae, 12 in the females, but they actually appear longer in the field. The males are like longer and droopier, and the female antennae are more sort of upright. You'll never see males with pollen ever, because they don't collect it and they can't carry it. You may see them covered in pollen by accident, but you'll never see them with pollen on their hind legs. And they're much more likely to be seen sitting on top of flowers, drinking nectar. They don't buzz around super quickly quite so much because they're not actually working like the females are. So it's again, it's a bit of a jizz around the male bees, but you do key into that with time. The females, in contrast, generally speaking, are neater. You can see this buff-tail bumblebee. She's got a really neat pile of her hairs. All of the females have shiny pollen baskets on their hind legs, so it isn't always as obvious as this particular queen. And they may be carrying pollen like this one. She's got huge pollen loads there, but not always. So if you see a bee with pollen, you know it's a female. But if there's no pollen, it could be either male or female, if that makes sense. And they have generally busier behaviour. Okay, so they're either collecting pollen or nectaring, frantically nectaring, or they're nest searching if it's a queen. Okay. So a little more detail on those antennae. So as I said, the females have short 12 segmented antennae, and you can see this is a female here on the left, and they're quite upright, and you can see that angle. And there's a male on the right with its long droopy antennae there. And just a bit more of a close-up, you can see the actual segments there. Short and sharp on the females, longer and droopier on the males. Okay. Oh, our hind legs. I want you to ignore the two right hand pictures here. So we'll just look at the female social bumblebee, this one, the first one, which has a lovely shiny hairless surface to its hind leg, but the males are skinnier in shape and they will have more hair on the hind leg. These are features that you really need to pot on a hand lens, and you need to pot the bee, which we'll come to at the end. So there's a male. Those are cuckoo bumblebees, so don't worry about those. And there's the pollen basket on the female. You can see it's triangular and shiny. Okay. When you go out in the field, because I know we've got a field day arranged for you, Richard will show you all of this in the field, or Sinead, whoever's doing it for you, and they're both super duper experts, so you'll see all of this in practice. Bumblebee faces are quite important, mainly to separate males and females, because, like I said, the males can have quite hairy faces, but also 4 of our 8 commonest species have a yellow moustache. And sometimes it's more than that. They have a whole yellow hairdo, which I'll show you in a bit. But also, for one of our species in particular, it's actually a couple, but one of our common species is distinguished by the shape of its face. And that's this one, the garden bumblebee, which I'll show you in a bit, which has a super duper long face, an elongated face, which sets it apart from other species. Okay. Right, I'm gonna whiz over the cuckoo one for today, but that's something that we can perhaps revisit next week, or when you're on your field course. So behaviour, female social bumblebees always tend to be working. So I'm just reiterating now what I've said. Queens will fly low and zigzag when looking for nests in the spring and early summer. And that's a queen that I took in my garden this spring, and she was rummaging around in the undergrowth looking for a good nest site. So they will land and explore holes and things. And then males and cuckoos tend to feed more lazily on top of flowers and not fly quite so much. And that's a group of males on perennial cornflower in my garden. You rarely see workers all sitting together like that in a group. It's quite a male behaviour thing in bumblebees to all group together like that. Right, would you like a quick comfort break, or would you like me to carry on? I'm happy either way. What's the general consensus? Terry, were you? I can't hear you, Terry. Let's have a look.
A break.
Yeah, let's go for a break. Okay, so it is 6. Can you see if everyone's back, Mag? I'm assuming they are.
Isn't back. So if we just wait 1 minute.
Okie doke. Has anyone got any questions on that first bit? I'm really happy for you to just shout out, because there's only a few of us. If you unmute or pop it in the chat.
Everyone's back from the look of it.
Okay.
Do the poll. Claire.
Oh, I forgot about the poll. I always forget about it.
Shall I launch it now?
Yeah, folks, I'm going to do a quick, just a poll, just 2 questions. All I want to do, I want you to go back 3/4 of an hour to when we started and just pop in your level of knowledge and experience before we met at 6 o'clock, please. And we'll do this poll again after the next course, just to see how you get on. So if you just answer the first question in terms of your knowledge of Bumblebee ID, and your second one in terms of recording. Oh, you can't unmute, Terry. That's, I've just read your comment. Yeah. Okay, we'll make sure we all unmute later. There we are. Megan's done that. And also, yeah, that's a good one, Mark. We'll definitely discuss that at the end. So that's good. Okie dokes. Right. So everybody's answered now. So we've got a variety of different levels of knowledge, but pretty good. Brilliant. Okay, thanks everyone. I have that poll for every course I do, and I never remember to do it at the beginning. I need to set an alarm or something. Okay, close that down. Right. Can you see my screen okay, Meg? All good?
Yes, all good.
Cool. Right. Okay, so once we've got our bumblebee, and we're pretty sure it's in this case a social bumblebee, there are again a suite of clues that people use, and I can see from the poll we've just done quite a few of you know some of your bumbles already. So in the Bumblebee Conservation Trust, they do focus very much on tail colour as the first kind of point of interest, if you like, in terms of separating the bumblebees out into the different species. But we also use the banding, so whether or not they have yellow bands and how many. In this case, no yellow bands at all. Facial hair, as I've already described, the legs, the antennae, and to some extent behaviour and seasonality as well, which we've also discussed. So now we're going to look more at the tail colour and banding, which is the kind of nitty-gritty of IDing, and we'll also take you further as well into some of the cuckoo bees and rarer bumblebees. Size isn't brilliantly useful because there are so many variations in size with bumblebees depending on how much they've eaten. Queens obviously tend to be biggest, and there is variation between species. So for example, buff-tailed queens tend to be really quite big. The ones you see early in the spring, red-tailed queens, like that one you can see there on the bottom right, are pretty big, but early bumblebee queens are actually, compared to those, quite small. So there's variation. And then workers vary so much, both between species and within species, and even within colonies. So a colony, the first batch of workers that the queen produces can be tiny because maybe she hasn't collected a huge ball of pollen and nectar and they haven't eaten that much. And then the next batch could be bigger because their sisters have helped feed them more. So huge variety in workers. Males tend to be more consistent within species and tend to be about 2/3 the size of the queen of the same species. So size can be tricky. So tail colour, when we describe tail colour, we're not only looking at the actual colour, but the extent of the colour. So all of these three species have orangey or red tails. The early bumblebee just has a tip of orange, which is often barely even noticeable because it's the very, very end of the abdomen, the very last segment. The red-tailed bumblebee, much more clearly defined, more extensive levels of red. And the bilberry bumblebee there on the right has the red going over halfway up the abdomen. So you can see the tail colour is different between these species, but consistent within species. So that's a really important distinguishing feature. The banding, we don't just look at the number of bands, but we also look at the position. So, for example, and we will be going over each species in a sec, but this white-tailed bumblebee has 2 yellow bands, always 2 in the females, one behind her head, which we call a collar, and then there's a yellow band in the middle, well, just above the middle of the abdomen there. Okay, the abdomen, the thorax. Oh, the abdomen, oh, sorry, I'm losing the plot. I've already done 2 hours before this. I've delivered this so many times. So thorax has 1 yellow band and abdomen has 1 yellow band. Sorry, folks. And then this one, the garden bumblebee, has 3 bands, and they are not only more in number, but positioned differently. So it also has the collar, but then it has a band at the back of the thorax and a band at the top of the abdomen. Okay, so in that species, it almost looks like you've got a band across the middle, but it's in fact 2, one on the thorax and one on the abdomen. And in this bee, it also has 2 yellow bands, but again, the positioning is different. So it has the collar, and then the second yellow band is actually above the tail, and that's actually a cuckoo bee. But the banding, the position is really important in identification. So we'll get into the nitty-gritty of naming species. And in the Bumblebee Conservation Trust, like I said, they focus very much on tail colour to distinguish groups of bumblebees. So on the left here, all of these have a white tail, and these 2 have a white tail. We're just going to look at the queens and workers here to start with, a white tail and 2 yellow bands. The males are slightly different. So we've got the buff tail at the top and the white tail bumblebee at the bottom. And then we have white tail and 3 yellow bands, as I described on the previous slide, 1, 2, 3. And we have 2 species in that group, the garden bumblebee and the heath bumblebee. And then we have the 2 common red tails, which is the early bumblebee, which has a little red peachy tail right at the tip. It's not actually quite as extensive as that shows, and 2 yellow bands. And the red tail bumblebee, which is all black with a red tail. And then the final 2 of the common 8, this one has a white tail, so it could be grouped with these. But I've put it here on the right because both of these bumblebees have a ginger thorax, but this one is ginger and black with a white tail, whereas the common carder is all ginger. So we've got the tree bumblebee and the common carder. And in the field, these 2 can sometimes be mistaken, which is why I've popped them in there, because it's good to compare them. So we'll do that in a bit more detail. There's the common 8 in photographs. So those are the just the queens. So we've got the buff tail and the white tail, both with white-ish tails and 2 yellow bands. So buff tail and white tail, but the buff tail, as its name suggested, the white is off-white, it's buffish. And we have the 2 red-tailed common bumblebees, the red-tailed bumblebee and the early bumblebee, distinguished by their stripes and the less red on the tail. And then bottom right, we have the 2 species that have a white tail, and 1, 2, 3 yellow bands. So one behind the head, one at the back of the thorax, and one at the top of the abdomen. Okay. And those two are actually distinguished by the length of their face. So in the garden bumblebee, it has that long horsey face. And in the heath bumblebee, it's a smaller species with a much rounder, sort of heart-shaped face, really. So that's when the shape of the face comes in to distinguish these two. And then last but not least, bottom right, we have the two with a ginger thorax. And you can see the common carder. It's a very variable species, actually, but it has ginger thorax, and then the abdomen can vary from being quite black to quite ginger to quite creamy coloured, but it never ever has a white tail, unlike the tree bumblebee, which always has a white tail. Okay, so that's how we distinguish those two. But when the common carder has a dark abdomen, they can look quite similar. All right, so that's the common 8 queens. And what I'm going to do now, I'm sorry, it is quite a lot of information in this presentation. So I hope you're all still with me. We'll just go through each species quickly. And in these slides, I've used the diagrams that are done by Bumblebee Conservation, but I have to say, this is the worst one of all. I think it's really terrible because the common carder rarely looks actually like that. It's much variable and often appears much darker, but we've got plenty of pictures and there you can see what I mean. The common carder there, all 3 casts are the same. We describe it as all ginger, but it often has a lot of black on the abdomen. It has creamy colour. You can see better on that one, on the sides of the thorax there. And the males and females are very, very similar. So with this one, if you're telling male and female, you're going to be looking at the antennae and the pollen baskets. This one on the right is a female. I can see a shiny pollen basket there. Okay, and just about make out her antennae. This one here is a male. He's got thinner legs and longer antennae. And this one here is a female as well. Okay, don't worry too much. They're quite hard to tell apart, so don't worry too much about that. Just get a feel for the species rather than the sex or the caste for that one. Yeah, they've got a really long nest cycle, so they'll come out in about April and you can still see them even in sort of September. So their nests are very long lasting. And then this somewhat comparable tree bumblebee didn't come into the UK till 2001 through what we're pretty sure is a natural colonisation. Again, no difference between the sexes, apart from the queens being bigger, workers being very variable in size. And we have a tawny thorax with a black abdomen and a snowy white tail. The only thing is with this little horror is you do get a melanic form, which is not uncommon, let's say, where they look like this. So they can have varying amounts of that russety red gingery colour on the thorax in the melanic forms. So you can see there's a tiny bit left there, but they do still always have their white tail. So if you see a pretty much black bee with a snowy white tail, it's very likely to be a melanic tree bumblebee. So keep an eye out for those. Okay, so that's the tree bumblebee. Likes nesting in bird boxes. Okay, and now our common 2 red-tailed species, the early bumblebee and the red-tailed bumblebee. So the early bumblebee is one of the first species to emerge in the spring. You often see them when the buff-tails emerge as well. And it's the UK's smallest species overall, or one of the 2 smallest species. The queens are quite stunning. I love them. I think they're really pretty. They're very common, really attractive, with their little orangey red bottoms there, their little tails, and two beautiful bright yellow stripes. And it's quite, I know I said females tend to have a neater hair pile, but this species is quite fluffy generally. The males more so. So really pretty bee. The workers often look like this and lose the second abdominal band, the second yellow band. So they have a yellow collar and a little tiny peachy tail, and they can be absolutely tiny, like smaller than a honeybee. They can be really small. And the males are extremely fluffy, absolutely beautiful, and they have tons of yellow on them. So really yellow face, loads of yellow fluff all around their head like a ruff. So yeah, very attractive species, the early bumblebee. Most of them have finished their nest colonies already, and some of them actually do a second one in the summer because they're very quick in completing their cycle. So red-tailed bumblebee, which I'm sure you're familiar with, certainly with the females, with their lovely striking scarlet bottoms and fully black body. Queens and workers are the same. The workers are just a smaller version. So there's a queen, and you can see her pollen basket there. But males of the red-tailed bumblebee, so red up to, but not over half the abdomen, and then yellow collar, second yellow band on the thorax there, and a yellow face as well. Okay, so this is one of our 4 males that has yellow on the face. So if you see a yellow face bee, it's bumblebee, I should say, it is going to be a male. I won't worry too much about the pollen baskets have black hairs. That's how to separate it from one of our rarer species. So, but yeah, they fade. The males especially fade really quickly, and by the end of the summer, these guys can be completely washed out and look very, very grey, and they lose all the colour in their tails. So it's much harder to identify them later in the summer because they never go back to the nest, so they're out in the sun all the time. They bleach really quickly. Okay, so we've done the gingers, we've done the red tails. So common white tails with 2 yellow bands now. And we've got the white tail bumblebee, actually its name, Bombus lucorum, where the queens and workers have the white tail, 1, 2 bright yellow bands. The males of this species have a lot of yellow, bright yellow face, extra yellow bands, and they can appear almost completely yellow. In contrast, the buff tail, the queens you can distinguish from white-tailed queens because their tail is buff. It's buff coloured and they have an altogether darker appearance. The males you can tell apart because they don't have a yellow face or any of the extra yellow bands. But Mark, you mentioned buff and white-tail workers, or buff and white-tail bumblebees. The workers, we generally say in the field, you cannot tell these species apart because white-tail workers always look like this, with a white tail and 2 yellow bands, and buff-tail workers are more variable, but they can look exactly like that as well. So generally speaking, we don't tell them apart. But we can tell the queens apart and we can tell the males apart. Okay, so in a bit more detail. So the buff tail, very large queens, and they really can appear quite dark. So buff coloured bottom, almost looking orangey there. And I always feel the stripes on the buff tail queens, they're almost like a marmalade colour really. They are very rich orangey yellow. There is some variation in stripe colour, but their tails are always buff in the queens. The workers and males of buff tails look super similar to each other, and you've got to rely totally on antennae and hind legs. And they both tend to have white tails with 2 brighter yellow bands, but they sometimes have a thin yellow band at the top of the tail. Okay, so that can help you distinguish them from white tails, but sometimes they don't. So they're, yeah, a bit annoying really. If in any doubt, you record it as a white stroke buff-tail worker. I hope that makes sense. Okay, and separating the workers and males takes practice as well. Okay, so this is the white-tailed bumblebee now. Just going over this again. So queens and workers are the same. 2 yellow bands on a white tail. Snowy white tail, never buff in the queens. Well, all the workers actually of this species. And the males have lots of yellow on them. So it can vary, but basically yellow face, yellow head, yellow ruff, and a lot more yellow on both the thorax and the abdomen. They're quite strange when you first see a white-tailed male. If you get a really yellow one, it's like, oh my goodness, what is that? Because they don't really look like any other bumblebee. So yeah, very pale. And they don't have that line across the top of the tail like the buff tails can do. And finally, we're nearly there, folks. We're nearly there. Common white tails. Now, 2 species which have white tails and the 3 yellow bands. So it's the garden bumblebee and the heath bumblebee. Okay, so the garden bumblebee is the one with a long face. So we'll go to that one first. Very, very common, this species. Quite a striking bee. Quite long. Like compare a buff tail, which tends to be more rounded and chunky. And the queens, the workers and the males all have the same pattern. So there's no extra yellow in the males. They're all the same. That's a queen. And you can see yellow stripes, one at the back of the thorax there, one on the abdomen, just behind her wing. Beautiful, obvious pollen basket and her long face. They're quite stunning creatures, the queen garden bumblebees. And that's a queen as well. So you can see she hasn't got a hairy face. The male's face is a bit more hairy than that, but not yellow. I don't know if I've got, I don't think I've got a picture of a male of this one, unfortunately, but they look very similar. So very long tongue, that's why they have those long faces. It's the longest tongue of any of our British bumblebees. So that's the garden bumblebee. And the heath bumblebee isn't so common. Sometimes I question if it should be in the big 8, as people call it, but because it's quite habitat restricted, because it favours heathland, so it isn't ubiquitous across the landscape. It does tend to be associated with heathland, but can occur in sort of species-rich grassland as well. It's a lovely species. I think it's a really attractive little species. So like the garden bumblebee, 3 yellow bands, white tail, but a rounded face. Queen's workers are the same colour. The males are very similar as well, but this diagram is a bit misleading because the males do have a little tuft of yellow. So that's a worker with her 3 bands clearly shown. And like the garden bumblebee, it's quite a small and fluffy species. They're quite closely related. And there's the male, and you can see he's got a tuft of yellow on his face on there as well. All right, so it's the same as the females, but a little bit more yellow around the head and face. I love finding the heath bumblebee. It's really, really nice species. Okay, I think we'll leave the quiz for now and maybe come back to it at the end if we've got time, because I've talked for ages. It feels even longer for me because I've actually been going for 4 hours. So I'm really sorry if I'm sounding a bit like a bit vague at times. But yeah, I hope that made sense. I hope it was useful. And please do feel free to unmute yourself and throw any questions at me, and I will try my best to answer them. And if not,